In this video, we're going to go ahead and fix a bug in our code, or in my code rather. And it's interesting. This particular bug was interesting to track down because it has to do with a pretty complex interaction between how all of our components are set up. But the primary reason why this bug occurred is because the Android activity lifecycle, unfortunately, the way most people understand it, actually happens to be wrong. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys this diagram, which you probably are familiar with this diagram. And it just shows basically all the different lifecycle events that get invoked during the lifecycle of an activity. So we have our onCreate, our onStart, onResume, onFreeze, onPause, onStop, and onDestroy. Now, generally speaking, what happens here is you would assume the onDestroy method gets invoked when the activity is destroyed, kind of like a destructor, right? Or a finalizer, or a disposable if you're a .NET person. So the idea here is that the onDestroy method will be invoked when the activity is absolutely not going to be resumed. Because as you can see here, it can be stopped and then resumed, but once it's destroyed, it's dead. So what we're doing here in the code with our event bus is we're registering for the event bus on the onCreate, and we're unregistering on the onDestroy. And why are we doing that instead of registering on the onResume and unregistering on the onPause, which most people recommend doing? The reason is, like I said when we wrote this code, is that I want events that request data to still invoke the callbacks on the activities that are still around, even if that activity is stopped or paused. So even if there's an activity on top of that other activity, if it's still resident in memory, I want it to receive a response from the API so that it can cache its internal data, and so when you resume that activity, that data is there. And that significantly decreases the complexity of the way the code is written. But unfortunately, it comes with a problem here. So instead what I do is onDestroy is where I do the unregistration. Well, it actually turns out that onDestroy won't necessarily be invoked when the activity is finished. So there are circumstances, and these particular circumstances aren't actually documented, to my knowledge, where the onDestroy method won't be invoked immediately after the onStop method, or immediately after the activity is disposed of. I guess I should say that what I'm saying right here is not necessarily the onDestroy method may not necessarily be invoked immediately when the activity is finished, is basically what I'm saying. And that means there could be a lag time. That means there could be an activity which for all intents and purposes is destroyed and finished and done with, but it still is going to be registered with the event bus. And that, combined with the way that I wrote the base authenticated activity, combines into a very, very difficult and hard to spot bug, a very difficult to debug bug, and a bug that only occasionally happens. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and we're going to fix this issue. So I want to point out exactly though what I mean about the base authenticated activity causing this problem. If you guys recall, the base authenticated activity, so the main activity, for example, inherits from the base authenticated activity. When it's created, it might kill itself before it starts up and sets its layout and all that stuff. It might go ahead and basically switch itself over to the authentication activity, so the authentication activity can reestablish the auth token. So the problem is if if a main activity, for example, if this gets launched, and it's the first thing to be launched, and we're not yet logged in, but we do have an auth token. If this gets launched, it'll be registered with the event bus. Then what'll happen is the authentication activity will be thrown or started. This activity will be finished, but if his onDestroy method isn't invoked yet, then when the main activity gets recreated, every time the main activity does something and needs a response, it's going to get two responses. One from the main activity that's currently on the screen, and one from the main activity that's still registered with the event bus that you can no longer see. And that'll cause really, really difficult to debug issues. So what I want to do here is I want to address this problem, and what I'm doing here is pretty hacky, but it's the best solution that I came up with. And again, the whole purpose of what we're doing here with handling the bus unregistration on the onDestroy is again trying to reduce complexity in the rest of our application. And unfortunately, in this particular case, it's going to require that we do something that looks a little hacky, but it'll work. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my base activity, and the code that I'm about to write is more or less I'm going to unregister ourselves from the bus in one of two cases. Either the finish method is invoked on the base activity, or the onDestroy method is invoked. However, unfortunately, Auto has this thing where it throws an exception if you try to unregister an object that hasn't yet been registered. So if we unregister the same activity twice, we'll get an exception. So you have to keep track of if we have unregistered yet as a Boolean is what I'm going to do here. So here at the top of base activity, I'm going to say private Boolean, and I'm going to say is registered with bus. Then what I'm going to do is immediately after we say bus.register this, I'm going to say is registered with bus equals true to indicate that we are indeed registered. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll all the way down to onDestroy, and I'm going to modify this slightly. I'm going to go ahead and add an if statement around this bus.unregister. I'm going to say if is registered with bus is true, but it's a Boolean, so I don't have to say equals true. Then bus.unregistered, and then say is registered with bus equals false. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to override a new method. So I'm going to say override public void finish. And then the first thing I'm going to do, of course, is invoke the super. And then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to basically repeat the code in our onDestroy. I'm going to say if is registered with bus, bus.unregister this. And then is registered with bus equals false. So this makes sure that if the finish method is invoked first, he will go ahead and unregister the activity from the bus. And if the onDestroy method, for whatever reason, is invoked and the finish method is not, the bus will still be unregistered from the bus. However, in my testing, the finish method is invoked in pretty much any case that the activity is no longer going to be used. It seems that that most of the internal Android code relies on the finish method, so it's a great place to put our unregistered code inside of. I tested it using like the back button, swapping activities, of course, if we invoke the finish method ourselves, and so on and so on. But anyway, what this does is this guarantees that our activities are unregistered when they're no longer in existence. And yeah, that's really that addresses that particular bug. So I guess we'll see you guys next video.